Joining us now to discuss is Marine veteran and Iraq War vet Dan Caldwell, the Vice President of the Center for Renewing America. Dan, thanks for being here tonight.
Thanks for having me on, Kara.
Great. So what do you think the deal is with this new Hungarian media, independent media thing that we're seeing coming from Samantha Power and her team over at USAID?
Well, this is part of a decades-long effort to reshape the former Soviet Union and the former Warsaw Pact that has largely been a failure. And it hasn't made America more safe or prosperous, and in fact has the opposite effect, because it's important to remember is that we are meddling in the politics of another country, in this case Hungary, which I would point out is a NATO ally. And these efforts, just like our efforts in the Middle East, produce blowback. And in this case, they have not empowered, so-called liberals in Eastern Europe, and in fact have given people like the Russians an examples of how America meddles in the politics of other countries. And I want to point something out. You had a really great intro, is that this is another example and should be another reminder to conservatives that liberal interventionism abroad fuels liberal interventionists here at home. We have woke and weaponized government here in the United States, and we are trying to export it abroad. So these efforts are interlinked. And so it is my hope that over the next few months that House Republicans, as part of their effort in looking at the budget, should take a close look at international programs like this, which again aren't tied to our safety, aren't tied to our prosperity, and in fact are being counterproductive to our overall foreign policy.
And you think also that many Americans need to be better, perhaps more adept at kind of reading between the lines on this, because I think some people read through and go either boring story, don't care so much, or they'll look and go, that seems like a good thing. We're helping Hungary, independent media, human rights, all the empty buzzwords. And basically what it boils down to, as you were mentioning or hinting at earlier, is the fact that the U.S. is looking at a NATO member like Hungary and saying, we don't like your politics. You're too conservative. You're too Christian. The migration thing, you're not behind us 100% on provoking war with Russia. Is that what it kind of boils down to? These empty, it's almost like they smile to the face of our allies, but behind, the back, they have that little knife twisting saying, do what we want, or we're going to come in and basically, start doing, I don't know if you want to use even the term psyops or whatever they're doing with this independent media whole shtick, but do we kind of need to read between the lines on some of these words that they deploy time and time again to say, we're only helping, as they leave failed state after failed state in their wake?
Yeah, absolutely. And as you pointed out, Samantha Power has been involved in some of the worst foreign policy disasters of the last 20 years. You gave a great overview of the Libya disaster, but she's also an advocate of funding so-called moderate rebels in Syria. And we saw how that's worked out. And the Syrians are paying an immense price today. And that's one of the reasons why the earthquake on the Turkish-Syrian border has been particularly worse for the Syrian people, because their country is still in the midst of a civil war, which was exacerbated by the funding of, again, so-called moderate rebels who are actually in most cases aligned with Al-Qaeda. And Samantha Power, as UN ambassador, was a chief advocate of that. And this is an important point, is that she is part of our foreign policy elite. And people like her who have been wrong on these major foreign policy issues, they aren't held accountable, and they're allowed to keep running programs like this through USAID, which again aren't making us safer, aren't protecting our prosperity. If anything, they're actually making us less safe by undermining some of our allies overseas.
So they're basically saying in Hungary, we're going to tell you what to think, how to report on things, and it's going to be our, leftist style, unfortunate way of doing media. The same way here in the U.S., you're a conservative, and you talk about things truthfully, and you're hit with disinformation or misinformation or all these, these silly labels. And I don't mean to say silly to just dismiss it, because this is very severe. This is what they've been doing for many decades to kind of change how we think and how we view different events going on. I remember, I think it was last year, back in April, perhaps, when there was that big election for Viktor Orban, and he won, of course, he won his re-election as prime minister in his party, and everything was very great. However, at the same time, I know they were flagging some concerns, saying it seems like the U.S. was pumping some money into our elections, but of course doing it in such a way where it kind of danced on that line of, is this really legal, is it not exactly legal, to help his opponent at the time at the polls and in the way he was viewed by the media. Of course, he had the whole international media just smearing Orban as just, this evil, this horrible man, fascist, and all this this stuff. But the way the U.S., I mean, if this is how we treat our friends, that says a lot. And do we kind of risk alienation when we're doing things like trying to provoke war with Russia, basically, when we're alienating our friends? Is that kind of not a good place for the U.S. to be in? Because we think, oh, we're getting more control over these smaller nations, trying to keep them in line with our larger policy goals. But are we really going to leave ourselves almost alone on the world stage?
I agree with you. I do not think this enhances our national security. It doesn't enhance our position in the world, and ultimately makes it more difficult for us to build strong relations with other countries. I would say, though, is that I don't think Samantha Power intended this, but I actually think in some way this helps Orban. He can say, look, this famous American liberal is coming to our country and funding these quote-unquote independent media institutions. It reinforces a narrative that he has accurately developed, that there are outside forces trying to undermine his government, and therefore it will strengthen them. It will probably push a lot of people closer to his government, because even people that were maybe on the fence about his government, is that there's still this thing called nationalism, and people are loyal to Hungary, loyal to their own nation. And even if they were skeptical of Orban, they probably don't like foreign powers coming into their country and meddling. So this is probably going to have the opposite effect from what Samantha Power and USAID intended, just like in the Middle East, just like in other parts of the world. And this is, for me, why these efforts aren't great, but they oftentimes, again, have the opposite intended effect than what a lot of these in many cases, do-gooders like Samantha Power intend.
And then, of course, you can look at Ukraine, where we've seen these influence operations for a long time, even outside some of these color revolutions. You have other groups that in a similar vein as USAID going in, like National Endowment for Democracy, for example, who one of their own co-founder said, we do overtly what the CIA used to do covertly. So he's kind of being very vocal about what they do and why they're in the nation, of course, telling Ukraine, we're behind you 100%, just keep poking that bear, keep poking, of course. And sadly, that nation, then they bear the consequences of all, the dead soldiers and everything else, the harm to their infrastructure, their economy, because we're using them for what we think, these neoliberal interventionists, these great global schemes that they have of, we can, take down Russia using Ukraine. Now, of course, the big fight over fighter jets, and of course, we're talking about sending tanks to Ukraine. It just seems like this escalatory spiral keeps going. Before I let you go tonight, I was wondering if you could touch on this kind of escalatory spiral that we still see right now as the war enters, almost into its second year at this point.
You put it perfectly. The Biden administration has us on an escalatory spiral within Ukraine, and it's scary to think about, but that could lead us to a confrontation with a nuclear-armed Russia. We need to step off of the spiral. We need to pull back American support, and we need to start creating the conditions for a negotiated end of this war, which is the only way it can end short of a all-out global conflict, including a nuclear exchange, which is obviously not in America's interest. I also point out, too, it's quickly becoming a question for the United States of not what we should do for Ukraine, but what we can do for Ukraine. The reality is we are running out of certain types of weapons and munitions to give Ukraine because our defense industrial base is so constrained. And we are emptying our arsenals, our magazines, and giving it to Ukraine, and our production lines can't replace what we are giving to Ukraine, much less backfill our own stockpile. So it's a very dangerous position. The Biden administration keeps saying that they know this war is going to end in a diplomatic resolution, but they certainly aren't acting like it.
Well, Dan, thanks for bringing back some common sense into this whole debacle that we see playing out before our eyes. Thanks for joining us tonight.
Thank you so much for having me on again.